I think it's going to be a presentation which will just introduce the following three presentations. So I'm going to talk about registration in general. I mean specifically our product and the general approach of the implementation of the product at a certain company. So what is the definition of registration? I think most of us are familiar with it, but I think the most important thing to say right here is that registration is something that should be mostly hidden from the end user. So the end user doesn't want to take care about anything related to validation and normalization. They just want to submit something and have it validated, normalized, and properly evaluated against matches and stored as expected. And as a result, you end up with generated IDs that you can refer to within your corporate environment, and the data stored in a controlled and well-organized way. It's certainly much more complex than that, but still, even if we go through all these steps, you end up with the very same concept. At some point, you might not be able to solve all these issues automatically. That's the point where we end up with the concept of the staging area, which provides a way to manually correct issues that occur during the submission. So what I'd like to present right now is a typical implementation case. And I believe in the next presentation, we will hear about a very specific implementation case from John. And in that presentation, you will see the specific issues that might arise during the implementation. What I want to emphasize is that in each stage that you see right here, we are aiming to have a working configuration. So at the very first deployment, even without any kind of configuration, you have a working configuration of the off-the-shelf product, which just works with the default configuration. Then you have an evaluation, you figure out the chemistry rules, configure it, customize it. Then you have another working system with the required configuration within that company. And you continue with the data migration, you refine your rules, you do the integration, you end up with a system that can be tested by the users themselves. And that's the point where you end up with a working system that's well integrated into existing environment. And finally, hopefully you have a successful final acceptance testing, and then you can release it to production. So the off-the-shelf implementation shouldn't take more than half an hour. And at the end of the deployment, you end up with a system that shows you a web user interface and the default configuration, and it can work with your structures immediately. Configuration tasks are, on the other hand, one of the most important things during the implementation, and the most common task, well, it's not related to chemistry, let's admit. So everyone wants to store, besides the chemistry, a ton of other data fields. Those data fields have to configure it at some point, somehow. So that's unfortunately or fortunately the most common task that we end up during an implementation. On the other hand, the most important task is setting up the chemistry rules, because that's what guarantees that at the end of the day, you end up with a consistent database. I believe we will hear a lot more about the typical standardization and validation issues related to chemistry at the very last presentation of this section by Tanya. And there is certainly everything else, what to do in certain specific cases, and so on and so on. So in order to make the user's life a little bit more simple, or, well, actually the administrator's life and our own life as well, because we end up with much less support requests this way. So we created a quite easy to use administration UI, which is continuously improved. And maybe it's not even the same right now in the very latest version that you can see on the video. But that gives you full access to all the options that you have within the application and that you can configure to fit to a specific requirement set. The migration is the second most important thing, maybe. Well, the first most important if you think about the fact that you might have millions of structures that have to be migrated, and that's the value that you want to keep in the system. So you simply upload the data with either the API or the front end, whichever you choose. And that's the point when you figure out that the chemistry rules are just not set up properly. Because that's going to be the point where you either have to make a decision that you stick to the rules that you imagined, or you refine the rules in order to have a much better ratio in terms of data migration, successful data migration. And you repeat these steps till you finish, and an acceptable portion is migrated. Typical structural issues, well, lots of them, but most of them are related to stereochemistry. And let's admit that in case of small molecules, that's the one of the most serious questions, especially if you're migrating from a pretty old legacy data system. Integration test and all the related stuff. That's something that we will hear in much more details, I believe, in Ian's presentation. So registration is never something that lives isolated in an environment. It's always connected to a couple of upstream systems like electronic lab notebooks that feed the registration, and a ton of reporting tools that work on the data that's been collected by the system. We offer several different APIs to have that kind of integration, and we're happy to collaborate with ELM providers, reporting application developers, and so on. User acceptance testing, that's one of the final stages, and I think the most important message here on this slide is that that's the point where you end up with some valuable feedback about the application itself, because that's the point when you can see it, how it works in real life use cases. And release to production, that's hopefully the end of a successful implementation story. You can see a couple of implementation use cases on our website in the library. And please feel free to find me with any questions that you have related to them. So we had a second product or pre-product mentioned in the title. That's inventory. And it is there because there are certain cases where you're not only interested in the chemistry, but also in the fact that where you store those things, how you manage them, amounts, places, locations, hierarchy, containers, whatever. So we started working on a very basic implementation, and we do not want to compete with any complex inventory solutions, but we want to extend the chemical intelligence in a way that it supports the most basic functionalities that are required related to that chemistry data that you preserve in the registration system, like samples, materials, locations, containers. These are the things that are already covered, so we can treat the batches within the registration system right now, even with the multi-component structures. And what we plan to have in the future inventory product is a flexible storage and container configuration that supports the most typical lab use cases. I'd like to say thank you to all those guys that helped the development of the products, and also to you for your attention. And please feel free to ask if anything's unclear.
With regards to the actual items that you have in the inventory, so is there an admin profile to it on the front end that would allow you to keep track of inventories, add to inventories, keep track of users, sites,
Yeah.
that sort of thing?
Yeah,
all involved with that?
Yeah, we have such an admin user interface in the registration already. I mean, a similar one, and we plan to extend it, and we plan to have a common UI for all those tasks that arise related to those topics.
So it's only within the registration project that it will allow you to use that same inventory then?
No. It will just be similar. So it's going to be, well, sort of a plugin of the registration product. But it will try to give you the same look and feel and same usability.
All right. I'll come by and talk to you. Thanks.